We're going back almost 10 years ago now, but one morning I dropped my son off at school and then drove over to a nearby 7-Eleven with my infant daughter. It was pretty early in the morning, so there were only one or two other customers, and one of them was this older-looking guy with a walker who was slowly making his way around the store. I didn't pay him too much attention other than feeling kind of sorry for him. Then I picked up the few items I needed, then headed out to my car. Right as I'm putting my daughter in her car seat, I hear a voice behind me. I turn, and it's the old man with the walker, only there's something weirdly different about him than when I saw him in the 7-Eleven. He was walking upright, not leaning on the walker, and his voice sounded much younger than you would have expected from just looking at him. I remember all he said was, "Cute kid." Then as I turned around, I only got the slightest look at the guy and his brand new posture before he slammed the walker into the back of my legs. The force made my knees buckle, and I almost fell right on top of my young daughter. I'm not exactly the tallest woman in the world, so the height reduction from my knees buckling had me falling forward into my open car door, and I had really tried not to crush her as I fell. I honestly thought that he was trying to get me, which was bad enough, but when he grabbed me by the hair and started to drag me up and off of my daughter, I realized he was trying to get to her instead. I honestly didn't think that I could get any more terrified, but the realization that he was actually trying to take my infant daughter away from me was just too much to bear. I remember letting out the loudest, most ear-splitting scream I've ever let out in my life, begging him not to take my baby. He was so much stronger and faster than he looked, and I guess that was all part of his fiendish scheme to have everyone let their guards down around him. It honestly seems like divine intervention now that I look back at it. But someone was just pulling into the small parking lot just as he almost had a hand on my daughter, and seeing the struggle had them instinctively honking their horn over and over in a bid to break it up. I think they figured it was just an incident of spousal abuse or something, because they were just honking and didn't get out of their car until I screamed over and over again, "He's trying to take my baby." The moment they heard that, they came bursting out of their driver's side door. But then the guy sprinted past the passenger side and out towards the main highway. The second he did, another car comes speeding up and stops by him, which I first thought might have been another person coming to tackle him or something. But instead, the guy climbs into the second car and it speeds off with a screech of its tires. What horrified me in the aftermath was that it was quite clearly a well-planned and almost perfectly executed attempt to kidnap my daughter, and I wouldn't be surprised in the least bit if it had worked on a previous occasion. After the kind stranger calmed me down, they helped me call the cops as I tried my best to calm my daughter down in turn. She was still too young to really know what was going on, but she picked up on my distress enough to be wailing and crying until I managed to lull her off to sleep. The cops who arrived at the 7-Eleven a short while after said that they'd never heard of such a thing happening there before, but they were able to check the street cameras outside the 7-Eleven to try and get a clear image of the getaway car's number plate. I stuck around long enough to find out that the car's plates came back as stolen, and the cop I spoke to said that there was a good chance that they just ditched the vehicle somewhere after wiping it down for prints. If they had already planned such a detailed operation out, there was a good chance they planned for that too. The only saving grace was that the officer assured me that my report was a step towards catching them. A small step, but a step nonetheless. The horrifying experience I went through that morning wasn't for nothing, as not only did the cops now have a description of the guy who tried to do the kidnapping, but their failure to kidnap my daughter meant that they'd probably hesitate before trying the same plan again. I took a lot of comfort in that idea, and if it wasn't for the cop taking the time to reassure me of that, I don't think I'd have dealt with the trauma of it as half as well as I did in the months that followed. But I did a lot of praying too. Desperate prayers that whoever had planned such a horrifying kidnap would never, ever be successful, and that no one else would have to endure the pure horror that I had. I used to work at a 7-Eleven here in the United States, and the scariest thing that ever happened to me there was also the single most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me in my life. It happened on a particularly quiet night, and I was still kind of hungover from going out drinking the night before. so I wasn't even paying attention when the guy walked into the store. I heard the door sliding open. I heard his footsteps as he walked up to the counter, and then right when I was about to lift my head up to ask him what he wanted, he just slammed something down on the counter in front of me. I remember the first thing being the red splatter on my t-shirt. It was plain white, and the moment his hand impacted on the counter, all these little red specks appeared on my shirt. I already recoiled from the shock of having his hand slammed down in front of me, but when I saw what he just slammed down next to the register, I recoiled even further. It was a tongue, an actual tongue. Even though it was soaked in blood, I could recognize the deep ridge running down the middle of it. It sounds like such a cliche when I think about it now, but I now know what people mean when they say that they were frozen in fear. The whole thing was an assault on my senses, and I think it just short-circuited my fight-or-flight mechanism to the point where I just didn't know what to do. Then the look in the guy's eyes as he stared at me, so calm but intense, with eyes so wide and unblinking that it was like he didn't have eyelids at all. It was only when he spoke that I actually found the will to move, and all he said to me was, "Call 911." I bolted into the back office, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the cops. All the while I watched the guy on the cameras just standing there at the register. He didn't move at all. He just seemed to be looking down and staring at the mess he'd left on the counter. And given the gruesome nature of my emergency, there was a police patrol car and 2 cops pulling up outside in just a matter of minutes. The guy didn't put up any kind of fight when they moved to arrest him. He just held his wrists, allowed them to put the handcuffs on him, then let the cops take him away. Once he was safely out of the store, I walked out of the office, trying not to look at what was on the counter, then told the cops everything I knew. It obviously wasn't all that much, but as I was talking to them, I noticed a few more police surrounding a car in the parking lot that still had the door open. I called the store manager from the McDonald's across the street, telling him that the cops had to close the store because it was an active crime scene. They rushed down to see what was going on, even though it was their day off, and after telling them what had happened, I went home to decompress. From what I heard later, the guy had gotten into an argument with his wife while out driving somewhere. Then at some point, he'd snapped, pulled up into a parking lot, stabbed her to death, then cut her tongue out. Then, for some reason, he picked our 7-Eleven to walk into to slam the tongue he'd cut out of her mouth down onto the countertop. I was allowed to take a little bit of time off of work after the whole thing, as I just couldn't face going back there so soon. Even when I did go back, I was on edge the whole time for my first couple of shifts, and I just couldn't seem to shake the image of that bloody tongue just lying on the countertop right in front of me. The thing I just can't seem to shake is that it wasn't enough for the guy to actually stab and kill his own wife. He had to reach into her mouth afterwards and cut her tongue out. How completely insane with fury does a person have to be to do that? Like, what could possibly possess someone to do something so horrifying to their own spouse? The guy didn't look like a monster either. He didn't look evil or deranged. All that gave his mental state away was that crazy look in his eyes, the one that had me frozen in fear. It just haunts me that seemingly normal people are capable of things like that. Back in the year 2018, I was still a university student, and to support myself, I worked part-time at a 7-Eleven here in my home of Chiodacho. Since the new school year hadn't quite started yet, I was still working night shifts, as despite the name, the 7-Eleven here is always open 24 hours. I tried to take advantage of the quiet nights by getting a head start on my studies, but that didn't stop the nights from being incredibly boring. So when I wasn't studying or serving the odd customer who came in, I was cleaning the store down. That's part of my nightly duties anyway, but then it becomes a real benefit during the nighttime shifts, and I can use up at least an hour each time I wipe down all the shelves, fridges, and displays. So one night, I'm cleaning the store when a customer comes in and starts browsing through some of the stock. I rush back behind the counter to serve him, but he told me that there was no rush, and he might be a while picking out some cold tea for his coworkers, as he too was working the nighttime shift as a security guard for a nearby apartment building. I thanked him for his thoughtfulness, then went back to what I was doing, which was cleaning down one of the refrigerator windows. I picked up my cloth and spray and began wiping down the fridge again when, suddenly, the entire store begins to gently vibrate. At first, it felt like that there was some kind of very large vehicle passing the store outside, like a tank or something. I know that might sound crazy, but that's what I thought at first. But then when it began to get more intense and everything on the shelves started to rattle and shake, one single word went through my head. Jishin, which means earthquake. The next thing I remember was turning with the intent of running back to the register to take cover under the counter, but as I turned, I saw the security guard running at me incredibly fast. I didn't know what he was planning on doing, but when he shoved me back to the ground, I found myself overcome with angry surprise, thinking, "What did you do that for?" Then, before I could even ask him what he was thinking, a pallet of glass bottles came crashing down from above the fridge I was cleaning, which is where we kept all the spares that would act as replacements for the fridge units. I'm not completely sure how heavy one of those are, but I know they're certainly heavy enough to cause some serious and permanent damage if one hit me on the head at those speeds. And it landed right where I'd been standing if the security guard hadn't shoved me out of the way. Suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore, not in the slightest, and all that fury changed into the purest form of gratitude I'd ever experienced in my life. I knew I had to repay it, and we trained to take cover under the reinforced counter in case of an earthquake, since it will protect us from any falling debris. I shouted at the man to follow me to the counter, and we both rushed towards it as best we could, as all kinds of things fell from their shelves while the floor shook violently beneath our feet. We took cover there for the next few minutes, and although it felt like far longer, the store stopped shaking after maybe only 30 to 40 seconds. There's no doubt in my mind how that security guard saved my life, or at least saved me from some serious and irreparable brain injuries. It makes me wonder what would have happened if he hadn't have walked into that store that night. I'd have been all alone when the earthquake hit. There's a good chance that I'd be dead, having joined the list of 40-plus people who died that night when the earthquake struck, or at least not in a fit state to write this email to you. I wasn't a believer in fate or destiny before that night, but now, I'm not so sure.